Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, where humanity clings to survival across a million worlds, where ancient Xenos empires scheme in the shadows, and where the forces of chaos threaten to consume reality itself, there exists a threat that grows stronger with each passing year. Not a plague of ravenous alien monsters, not an invasion from the Imperium, not even the slow decay of the Imperium from within. This threat comes in the form of a single greenskin warlord whose name has become synonymous with apocalyptic warfare on a galactic scale. Ghazghkull mag Uruk Thraka, the beast of Armageddon, the prophet of the Great Crusade, a creature whose very existence defies everything the Imperium of man thought it understood about the Orc menace. To understand the magnitude of the threat Ghazghkull represents, you must first understand what makes him different from the countless other Orc warlords who have risen and fallen throughout the long millennia of human history. The Orcs, as a species, are creatures of the eternal present. They live for battle, for conquest, for the simple joy of violence and destruction. They keep no records of their past glories. They build no lasting monuments to fallen heroes. When an Orc dies, he is forgotten almost immediately, his name lost to the constant churn of warfare that defines greenskin existence. But Ghazghkull is different. Ghazghkull has vision. He sees not just the battle before him, but the war that stretches across decades and centuries. He remembers defeats and learns from them. He plans campaigns that unfold across multiple star systems. Yet he understands his enemies in ways that should be impossible for a creature whose brain is supposedly hardwired for nothing but mindless aggression. Where other Orc warlords are content to smash whatever is in front of them until they either win or die, Ghazghkull thinks. He strategizes, he adapts. And most terrifying of all, Ghazghkull believes with absolute certainty that he has been chosen by the twin Orc gods, Gork and Mork, to unite every greenskin in the galaxy under a single banner and drown the stars in an eternal tide of green-skinned warfare. The Imperium has faced Orc invasions before, countless times in fact. Great green hordes have swept across Imperial space, devastating whole sectors before finally being contained and destroyed. But these were temporary phenomena, brief eruptions of violence that burned hot and fast before collapsing under their own momentum. The Orcs would fight until their warlord was killed, then fragment into feuding tribes that could be eliminated piecemeal. It was a pattern the Imperium had learned to manage, if not entirely prevent. Ghazghkull has shattered that pattern. His crusades don't simply burn out when faced with determined resistance. They adapt, they evolve, they retreat when necessary, regroup, and return stronger than before. Under his leadership, the Orcs have demonstrated a level of strategic cohesion that borders on the impossible. He has turned the scattered tribes of violent primitives into something approaching an actual military force, one capable of threatening not just individual worlds, but the very structure of imperial civilization itself. And his name translates roughly to Metal Skull, the great Orc ruler, in Low Gothic, and it's a title he has more than earned. The adamantium plates that replace portions of his shattered skull have become a symbol of his near invincibility, a physical manifestation of the divine favor he claims to possess. When Ghazghkull speaks, billions of Orcs listen. When he calls for war, entire sectors tremble. The story of how a simple Orc boy from a backwater world became the single most dangerous greenskin in the galaxy is one of violence, divine intervention, cunning strategy, and an iron will that has bent the course of history to its purpose. It's a story that begins in blood and has yet to find its ending. It's a story that every citizen of the Imperium should know, because Ghazghkull mag Uruk Thraka is not finished, not by a long measure. And with each passing year, with each new world brought under his influence, with each new tribe that swears allegiance to his banner, the green tide grows stronger. The galaxy itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when this prophet of destruction finally succeeds in his impossible goal. What happens when every Orc in the galaxy marches under a single banner? What happens when Ghazghkull completes the great work his gods have set before him. The Imperium may not have to wait much longer to find out. The birth of a prophet. Origins on Urk. Every legend has its beginning, and Ghazghkull's story starts in the most unremarkable way imaginable for an orc. No prophecy announced his birth. No signs in the heavens marked him as special. He was simply another orc boy in the armies that swarmed across the surface of Urk, as a world that meant nothing to anyone except the greenskins who called it home. The year was 932 M41, though such dates meant nothing to the orcs who lived there. Time, to a greenskin, is measured in battles fought and enemies crushed, not in the careful chronology that obsesses the human administratum. On Urk, young Ghazghkull was just one more face in the endless mob of orcs that comprised the Goth clan, one of the most warlike and violent of all the orc tribes. Even among orcs, the Goths were known for their love of combat and their disdain for anything that didn't involve hitting things very hard. Ghazghkull fit right in. He was strong, aggressive, and more than willing to prove himself in the constant battles that raged across Urk's surface. There was nothing particularly special about him, no hint of the destiny that awaited. Just another brawler in a species defined by endless brawling. Then came the raid that would change everything. The Space Marines had established a hidden command sanctum on Urk, tucked away atop a remote mountain crag, where they believed it would be safe from orc interference. It was a reasonable assumption. Most orcs wouldn't notice such a facility, and even if they did, they'd be more interested in fighting each other than organizing an assault on a well-defended Imperial position. But the orcs of Urk were particularly aggressive, even by greenskin standards, and the presence of the Space Marine facility was like a red flag to a bull. When the Goths discovered the hidden base, they did what orcs do best. They attacked, not with any particular strategy or plan, just a howling mob of green-skinned warriors charging up the mountainside, eager to prove their strength against the legendary Space Marines. The base's automated defense systems activated immediately, filling the air with bolter fire and last blasts that tore through the advancing orcs with devastating efficiency. Ghazghkull was in the initial rush, part of the vanguard that bore the brunt of the defensive fire. Orcs fell around him, their bodies torn apart by the withering barrage, but he kept running. That's what orcs do. They don't retreat, don't take cover, don't display anything resembling tactical sense. They just keep moving forward, trusting in their natural toughness and the sheer weight of numbers to carry them through. It almost worked. Ghazghkull was nearly to the base entrance when a bolter round found him. The mass-reactive shell struck him directly in the head, penetrating his skull and detonating inside his brain. The explosion pulverized roughly 30% of his cranium and turned a substantial portion of his grey matter into an unrecognizable pulp. By any reasonable measure, Ghazghkull should have died instantly. The damage was catastrophic, far beyond anything that should have been survivable. But orcs are not reasonable creatures, and their biology operates on principles that make Imperial Medicae specialists weep in frustration. Ghazghkull didn't die. Instead, he staggered backward, blood and brain matter leaking from the massive wound in his skull, and somehow remained on his feet. He actually got back up, demonstrating the kind of toughness that Goths respect above all else. His mob saw him standing there, a one hand pressed to his ruined head in a futile attempt to keep his brains from falling out, and they made a decision. Ghazghkull had proven himself tough enough to survive what should have been an instantly fatal wound. That made him valuable. More importantly, word had spread through the orc camps that a particularly mad Deathskull's pain boy named Grotznik was paying for fresh subjects to experiment on. Fresh subjects meant teeth, the orc currency, and teeth meant the mob could afford better weapons and equipment. So they dragged the barely conscious Ghazghkull away from the battlefield, one hand supporting him as he stumbled along, still trying to hold the fragments of his skull together with increasingly bloody fingers. The journey to the Deathskull's outpost at Rustspike took hours, and every step should have killed him. The brain damage alone should have been unsurvivable. The blood loss should have finished what the bolter round started. But Ghazghkull kept walking, kept breathing, kept existing through sheer orcish stubbornness. When they finally reached Rustspike and presented their prize to Mad Doc Grotznik, the pain boy was delighted. Here was a patient who had survived massive head trauma and was still, technically, alive. The possibilities for experimentation were endless. Grotznik paid the mob 3 teeth and a new chopper for Ghazghkull, which his former companions considered a fair trade. What happened next in Grotznik's surgery would change the course of galactic history, though neither the pain boy nor his patient knew it at the time. Mad Doc Grotznik was called mad for good reason, even by the standards of orc pain boys, who treat surgery as a combination of engineering challenge and creative hobby. Grotznik was notorious for his experimental approach to medicine. He saw patients not as orcs to be healed, but as opportunities to test new theories and techniques. The fact that most of his patients died screaming on his operating table didn't bother him in the slightest. Those who survived his ministrations often wished they hadn't. Ghazghkull's surgery lasted for days. Grotznik worked with manic energy, rebuilding the shattered portions of skull with whatever materials he had on hand. Adamantium plates were riveted directly into the remaining bone structure. Bionic components replaced destroyed tissue. Wires and squig sinew were woven through the damaged brain matter in patterns that made sense only to Grotznik's addled mind. On the whole assembly was held together through what can only be described as orcish ingenuity, which is to say, it looked like it shouldn't work, but somehow did anyway. When Grotznik finally finished and stepped back to admire his work, he expected his patient to either die or wake up as a drooling vegetable. That was the usual outcome of such extensive brain surgery, after all. Instead, Ghazghkull's eyes snapped open with perfect clarity, and the pain boy realized that something unexpected had happened. Ghazghkull could see, not just in the literal sense, though his new bionic eye gave him enhanced vision across multiple spectrums. He could see in ways that orcs aren't supposed to be capable of. The world around him had gained a clarity and depth that it had never possessed before. More importantly, he could see things that weren't there. Visions, messages, communications from entities that existed beyond the material realm. Gork and Mork, the twin gods of the orc race, were speaking to him. The exact nature of what Ghazghkull experienced in those first moments of consciousness after his surgery is known only to him. The visions he described later were fragmented and confused, filtered through an orc's limited vocabulary and understanding of metaphysical concepts. But the message was clear enough. He had been chosen, selected by the orc gods themselves for a great purpose. His near-death experience, the destruction of his brain, and Grotznik's crude surgery had somehow unlocked latent psychic potential that now connected him directly to the Gestalt consciousness of the orc race and the divine entities that embodied it. Gork and Mork showed him a vision of unity, as every orc in the galaxy united under a single banner, a great crusade that would sweep across the stars, crushing every other species before it, an eternal war that would please the gods beyond measure. And at the center of it all, leading this impossible undertaking, was Ghazghkull himself. He was to be their prophet, their instrument, the physical manifestation of their divine will. Most orcs, if they had such a vision, would dismiss it as the side effect of brain damage, or perhaps a particularly vivid dream after eating the wrong kind of mushroom. But Ghazghkull believed. With absolute, unshakable certainty, he believed that Gork and Mork had spoken to him, that they had preserved his life for a reason, that he was destined for greatness beyond anything any orc had achieved in living memory. And belief was in the Warhammer 40,000 universe has power, especially among the orcs, whose psychic gestalt field can literally reshape reality to match their collective expectations. If enough orcs believe something is true, it becomes true. And Ghazghkull believed with the force of absolute conviction. He rose from Grotznik's operating table, not as the common orc boy who had been brought in, but as something new. something different. A prophet with a mission and the unshakable will to see it through. The adamantium plates in his skull weren't just medical prosthetics. They were a symbol of his transformation, a physical mark of divine favor that would become his most recognizable feature. Grotznik, for his part, was simply pleased that his patient had survived. The fact that Ghazghkull claimed to be in direct communication with the orc gods was interesting, but not particularly unusual. Many orcs, especially those who survived severe head trauma, claimed all sorts of things. Most of them were ignored. But Ghazghkull was different. When he spoke, other orcs listened. There was something about him now, some indefinable quality that commanded attention and respect. Within 6 years, Ghazghkull had risen to become war boss of his tribe. This was an almost unheard of ascent for an orc who had been a nobody just half a decade earlier. Orc society is brutally simple. The biggest and strongest leads, and anyone who disagrees can challenge for the position. Ghazghkull wasn't the biggest orc in the tribe, though he was certainly large enough. He wasn't necessarily the strongest, though his combat prowess was formidable. What set him apart was his tactical acumen and his ability to inspire other orcs through the sheer force of his personality and his unshakable faith in his divine mission. He won his position through a combination of brutal combat and cunning manipulation of orc politics. Rivals who challenged him were defeated, not just through strength, but through tactics that caught them off guard. Ghazghkull fought smart, using the environment, exploiting weaknesses, and demonstrating a level of strategic thinking that impressed even the most battle-hardened orc veterans. When he headbutted opponents with his adamantium-reinforced skull, it wasn't just a display of strength. It was a reminder that he had survived something that should have killed him, that he had been marked by the gods themselves. And by 938-41, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka was the undisputed leader of his tribe, and his influence was beginning to spread to other orc groups on Urk. He preached his vision of unity, of a great crusade that would unite all orcs under a single banner. Most war bosses would have been laughed at for such grandiose claims, but Ghazghkull's absolute conviction and his proven combat record gave his words weight. Then the gods themselves seemed to confirm his prophecy. Urk's sun began to die. The dying sun and the Space Hulk. The dying of a star is a process that unfolds over millions of years, a slow fade from vibrant, life-giving energy to cold, dark silence. Except when it doesn't. Urk's sun had entered the final, violent stage of its stellar evolution far earlier than astronomical models would predict. And it was doing so with catastrophic speed. Severe solar flares erupted from the sun's surface with increasing frequency, bathing the planet in deadly radiation that even orc physiology struggled to withstand. Orcs are remarkably resistant to environmental hazards. They can survive in conditions that would kill a human in seconds, adapt to toxic atmospheres, and shrug off radiation doses that would liquefy lesser species. But there are limits even to greenskin durability, and Urk's sun was rapidly approaching those limits. The radiation storms were intense enough to penetrate orc settlements, cooking the inhabitants in their own juices despite their natural resistance. Bodies began piling up. Even the toughest orcs, those who had survived countless battles, found themselves succumbing to radiation poisoning. For most orc tribes, this would have meant death or evacuation. But Ghazghkull saw something different. He saw opportunity. He gathered his tribe and told them that this was the sign he had been waiting for. Gork and Mork were speaking through the dying sun, telling the orcs of Urk that their time on this world was over. They were meant for greater things. The gods would provide a means of escape, and when they did, Ghazghkull would lead them to glory. It was a bold claim, one that could easily backfire if the promised divine intervention failed to materialize. But Ghazghkull's faith never wavered, and his absolute certainty infected the orcs around him. They believed because he believed, and their collective belief began to warp the fabric of reality in ways both subtle and profound. Then, As if in answer to Ghazghkull's prophecy, a massive space hulk appeared in orbit around Urk. Space hulks are terrifying phenomena, even by the standards of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. They are vast conglomerations of ships, asteroids, space stations, and unidentifiable debris that have been fused together through centuries of drifting through the warp. Each hulk is a maze of twisted corridors, abandoned chambers, and deadly hazards, often inhabited by everything from orc looters to genestealer cults to literal demons. They drift in and out of real space seemingly at random, appearing without warning and disappearing just as mysteriously. The arrival of this particular hulk, at this exact moment, when Urk's orcs most needed a means of escape, seemed too convenient to be coincidence. Or later analysis by Imperial scholars would suggest that the appearance was engineered by elder Farseers, who foresaw the threat Ghazghkull would pose and attempted to divert it away from a threatened craftworld. Whether this is true, or whether it was truly divine intervention, remains a matter of debate. What isn't debatable is that Ghazghkull immediately claimed the Hulk's appearance as proof of his divine mandate. Gork and Mork had provided their escape route, exactly as promised. Now came the hard part, convincing the other orc tribes on Urk to follow him. Urk wasn't home to just one orc tribe. Multiple clans and warbands occupied different regions of the planet, each led by its own war boss, each fiercely independent and suspicious of any attempt at outside control. But the idea of uniting them all under a single leader was ambitious to the point of absurdity. Orcs don't unite willingly, they follow strength, and they respect only those who can prove their dominance through combat. Ghazghkull gave them a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Join him, or die on this radiation-scorched world when the sun finally killed them all. Some war bosses agreed immediately, recognizing both the logic of the situation and the strength of Ghazghkull's vision. Others needed convincing of a more physical nature. Ghazghkull challenged them directly, and those who refused to back down found themselves on the wrong end of his power claw and reinforced skull. The process took weeks, but Ghazghkull succeeded where countless other would-be unifiers had failed. Through a combination of persuasive argument, he demonstrated strength, tactical cunning, and sheer force of personality. He brought every orc tribe on Urk under his banner. They would follow him into the Space Hulk, into the unknown, into whatever destiny Gork and Mork had planned for them. The boarding operation was chaos incarnate, exactly as you'd expect from orcs. Hundreds of crude boarding craft launched from Urk's surface, each packed with green-skinned warriors, eager for whatever battles awaited them. Many craft crashed into the Hulk's surface, killing their occupants instantly. Others were torn apart by the Hulk's automated defense systems, or collided with each other in the confusion. But enough made it through, and soon the interior of the Hulk echoed with the sounds of thousands of orcs exploring their new home. What they found was both promising and terrifying. The Hulk was massive, large enough to house millions of orcs comfortably. Its twisted corridors contained ancient technology from humanity's lost past, Xenos artifacts of unknown purpose, and vast cargo holds that could be converted into habitation areas. There was space, there were resources, and there was potential. There were also demons. The Hulk's journey through the warp had left it infested with entities from beyond reality. When the Geller fields that protected ships during warp travel failed, as they inevitably did on these ancient derelicts, demons poured in through the tiers in space. They had taken up residence in the darker corners of the Hulk, waiting for new prey to stumble into their domains. For most species, encountering a demon infestation would be cause for immediate evacuation. For the orcs, while it was a delightful surprise, finally, something to fight that wasn't another orc. The battles that followed were vicious and unrelenting, with orcs and demons clashing throughout the Hulk's labyrinthine corridors. Hundreds of orcs died in these engagements, but hundreds more survived, gaining valuable combat experience against an enemy that didn't fight like anything they'd encountered before. Ghazghkull himself led many of these assaults, always at the forefront of the fighting, demonstrating the tactical acumen that would become his trademark. He didn't just throw his orcs at the demon hordes in mindless charges. He used the Hulk's geography to his advantage, setting ambushes, controlling choke points, and demonstrating that careful planning could be just as effective as raw aggression. And the climax came when they discovered the source of the demon infestation, a massive warp rift at the heart of the Hulk, a tear in reality that connected the material universe to the Imperium itself. Demons poured through it in endless waves, and as long as it remained open, the Hulk would never be secure. Most commanders would have avoided the rift, sealed off that section of the Hulk, and hoped the problem would solve itself. Ghazghkull took his best warriors and marched straight toward it. The fighting grew more intense with each step, the demons more powerful and numerous. Lesser orcs fell back, overwhelmed by the sheer otherworldly horror of what they faced. But Ghazghkull pressed on, his faith in his divine mission unshakable. At the rift itself, he came face to face with a massive bloodthirster, one of Horn's greatest demons. The creature towered over him, wreathed in flame and radiating an aura of pure malevolence that would have broken the mind of any normal being. Ghazghkull bellowed a challenge and charged, his power claw crackling with energy, his adamantium skull gleaming in the hellish light of the rift. The battle was brief, but brutal. The bloodthirster was vastly more powerful than any foe Ghazghkull had faced before, but the orc warboss fought with the certainty that Gork and Mork were watching, that he was their chosen instrument, that he could not fail. When his power claw finally connected with the demon's chest, the force of the blow sent the bloodthirster tumbling backward through the rift. Ghazghkull didn't stop there. In a display of either supreme confidence or absolute madness, possibly both, had he charged headfirst into the rift itself and headbutted it closed. The adamantium plates in his skull rang like a bell as they made contact with the fabric of reality, and the warp rift sealed with a thunderous crack that echoed throughout the entire Hulk. The demons, cut off from their source of reinforcement, were quickly overwhelmed and destroyed. The Hulk was secure. Ghazghkull had proven once again that his divine mandate was real, that he was protected by forces beyond mortal understanding. The orcs who had followed him were now completely convinced of his status as the prophet of Gork and Mork. The Space Hulk was renamed World Killer, and Ghazghkull set about transforming it from a derelict into a mobile war platform. Mech boys worked around the clock installing weapon systems, fortifying critical areas, and attempting to make the ancient engines functional enough to guide their new home through the warp. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't safe, but it worked well enough. During this time, another crucial event occurred. Mad Doc Grotznik, who had accompanied Ghazghkull to the Hulk, killed Makari, Ghazghkull's banner waver and constant companion. In Orc society, this wouldn't normally be a big deal. Gretchen, the smaller cousins of orcs, are considered disposable. But Makari was special, and Ghazghkull ordered the grot to be reincarnated into a new body. This established a pattern that would continue throughout Ghazghkull's career. Every time Makari died, which happened frequently, a new Gretchen would be selected and declared to be the new Makari. Whether this was actually reincarnation or simply Ghazghkull's way of ensuring he always had a banner waver is unclear. What mattered was that it reinforced the supernatural aura surrounding the warboss. Here was an orc who could command even death itself, who could bring back the fallen through sheer force of will. With the Hulk secured and his forces united, Ghazghkull set course for the warp. Their destination was unknown, left to the whims of the warp currents and the guidance of Ghazghkull's visions. Time passes strangely in the warp, and exactly how long the journey took is impossible to determine. Months could have been years, years could have been centuries, but eventually the World Killer emerged from the Imperium into real space, and Ghazghkull laid eyes on his target, the Armageddon system, a heavily industrialized hive world that was strategically vital to the Imperium's war machine, a world that would soon know the wrath of the prophet of Gork and Mork. The second war for Armageddon, First Blood, when the Space Hulk designated Alveus Alpha. Alpha Sextus by Imperial Administratum Adepts emerged from the warp near Armageddon in 941 M41. The system's defenders initially classified it as a standard navigational hazard. Space hulks appeared regularly enough that their presence, while concerning, didn't automatically trigger full military mobilization. Standard procedure was to mark its location, monitor its trajectory, and dispatch a small investigation team if it posed a threat to shipping lanes or planetary orbits. This complacency was the first of many mistakes that would define the Second War for Armageddon. One, the Hulk didn't drift aimlessly through the system as expected. Instead, it accelerated toward the planet with purpose and intent. Its ancient weapons system somehow still functional after countless millennia of neglect. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came when the Hulk opened fire on Armageddon's outer defense satellites, reducing the obsolete orbital platforms to scrap with contemptuous ease. Desperate warnings were transmitted across the system. This was no derelict. It was a weapon platform under active control, and it was heading directly for Armageddon itself. Emergency protocols were activated. Planetary defense forces were scrambled. Astropathic messages were sent to nearby Imperial Navy battle groups and Space Marine chapters. But these responses took time, and time was a luxury Armageddon didn't have. 1 month after the Hulk first appeared, it reached Armageddon orbit. What happened next would be studied in Imperial military academies for generations as an example of how a well-defended world can fall to a determined enemy. The invasion began on the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, a date with symbolic significance that Ghazghkull almost certainly chose deliberately. While the planet's citizens gathered in cathedrals and celebration squares to commemorate their god-emperor, Orc boarding craft began falling from the sky like deadly rain. Hundreds of crude pods plummeted through the atmosphere, many burning up or crashing catastrophically, but enough survived to deliver their cargo of howling greenskins to Armageddon's surface. The initial landings were scattered across multiple continents, but with no obvious strategic focus. To the Imperial commanders trying to coordinate a response, it looked like random chaos, orcs being orcs and attacking whatever was closest. But Ghazghkull's actual strategy was more sophisticated than it appeared. The scattered landings forced the defenders to split their forces, preventing them from concentrating their strength at any single point. While Imperial forces rushed to contain one landing zone, orcs were establishing beachheads elsewhere, and all the while, more and more greenskins poured down from the Hulk.
You know, what really fascinates me about Ghazghkull is how he breaks every expectation we have about orcs. When I first got into Warhammer 40k, I thought orcs were just the comic relief faction. Big, dumb brutes who existed to get mowed down by Space Marines. But Ghazghkull, he's genuinely terrifying because he thinks, he learns, he plans decades in advance, and honestly, that makes him more dangerous than half the Chaos Lords or Tyrant Hive fleets out there. The idea that an orc could outwit Imperial strategists who've trained for centuries, that's the kind of storytelling that makes 40k so compelling. But anyways, let's continue the video.
Ghazghkull had brought millions of orcs to Armageddon, a horde larger than any greenskin invasion the planet had faced in living memory. They came armed with looted Imperial weapons, crude but effective orc technology, and an absolute conviction that their prophet would lead them to victory. The planetary governor of Armageddon at this time was Overlord Hermann von Straub, a man whose incompetence and arrogance would contribute as much to the orc victory as Ghazghkull's tactical genius. Von Straub was a product of the imperial nobility, appointed to his position through family connections rather than merit. He viewed the orc invasion not as an existential threat, but as an inconvenience that would be dealt with quickly by his supposedly superior forces. His first mistake was refusing to request immediate military assistance from outside the system. Von Straub believed that admitting he needed help would make him look weak, potentially damaging his political standing within the Imperium. He was convinced that Armageddon's extensive planetary defense forces, as combined with its well-armed PDF regiments, would be more than sufficient to handle what he described as a minor Xenos incursion. This assessment was catastrophically wrong. His second mistake was micromanaging the defense with no understanding of military strategy. Von Straub overruled his military commanders at every turn, insisted on tactics that made no tactical sense, and refused to evacuate civilian populations from combat zones because he believed it would cause unnecessary panic. The result was chaos in the Imperial command structure, with experienced officers unable to respond effectively to the rapidly evolving situation. There was, however, one man who saw the invasion for what it was: Commissar Sebastian Yarrick. Yarrick was already an old man by the time the Second War for Armageddon began, all scheduled to retire on the very day the Orcs landed. He had served in a dozen campaigns as a commissar with Armageddon's planetary defense forces, earning a reputation for unwavering loyalty to the Emperor and an unusual understanding of how Orcs thought. In his youth, Yarrick had learned the Orc language from a captured raider, studying their culture and psychology with scholarly dedication. This knowledge made him uniquely qualified to understand the threat Ghazghkull posed. When the first reports of the invasion came in, Yarrick immediately recognized that this was no ordinary Orc raid. The coordination of the landing zones, the sheer size of the invasion force, the methodical way the Orcs were establishing their beachheads, all of it suggested a level of strategic planning that Orcs weren't supposed to possess. Yarrick studied the patterns, analyzed the tactics, and came to a frightening conclusion. Whoever was leading this invasion was far more intelligent and dangerous than any Orc warlord he had encountered before. He tried to warn von Straub. The Overlord not only ignored his concerns, but actively punished Yarrick for circumventing the chain of command by sending astropathic messages requesting Space Marine assistance. As punishment, von Straub banished Yarrick to Hive Hades, the most remote and least strategically important hive city on the planet, where he could be forgotten and ignored. This decision would ultimately save Armageddon. As the war progressed, the pattern Yarrick had identified became impossible to ignore. The Orcs were winning, not through overwhelming force alone, though their numbers were certainly formidable, but through actual military strategy. Ghazghkull had studied the layout of Armageddon during his approach, identifying the key hive cities and industrial centers that formed the backbone of the planet's infrastructure. He targeted these locations with brutal efficiency, overwhelming defenders before they could organize effective resistance. Hive after hive fell to the green tide. Infernus Hive was overrun in the war's opening weeks, its defenders overwhelmed by wave after wave of Orc attackers who seemed willing to die in infinite numbers to achieve their objectives. Acheron Hive lasted longer, its defenders mounting a heroic but ultimately futile resistance before being driven from the ruins. Deathmire, Volcanus, Tartarus. Each hive's fall followed a similar pattern. The Orcs would surround it, probe for weaknesses, then launch overwhelming assaults at the identified vulnerable points. At Hive Hellsreach, the civilian population mounted one of the most desperate and heroic defenses in Imperial history. When it became clear that military forces could not hold the city, the civilians themselves took up arms. They organized into militia groups, set ambushes in the Hive's countless corridors and under-city passages, and demonstrated a level of courage that impressed even the Orcs. Suicide bombers strapped explosives to their chests and charged into Orc formations. Crane operators welded themselves into their massive machines and used them to battle Orc gargants in improvised mechanical duels. The resistance was so fierce that even Orc commanders wondered if conquering the Hive was worth the cost. The city ultimately fell when Orc Weirdboys launched a massive psychic assault, destroying the minds of every human left defending the Hive. But the sacrifice bought precious time for other parts of Armageddon to prepare their defenses. Through all of this, one hive remained unconquered: Hades. At Hive Hades, Commissar Yarrick had used his enforced exile to do what he did best: prepare for war. He organized the Hive's defense with meticulous care, training militia forces, fortifying choke points, and establishing supply lines that could sustain a prolonged siege. When the Orc forces finally turned their attention to Hades, they found a city ready to fight, and a defender who understood them better than they understood themselves. Ghazghkull himself took personal command of the assault on Hades' hive, recognizing that this stubborn resistance needed to be crushed if he was to claim total victory on Armageddon. He threw everything at the hive's defenses. Elite commandos were dropped onto the hive spires in daring raids, only to be ambushed and eliminated by defenders who had anticipated exactly this tactic. Massive siege engines were constructed and deployed, but Yarrick countered them with his own artillery emplacements and demolition teams. Ghazghkull even retrofitted gargants with earth-moving equipment, attempting to literally dig under the hive's walls, but underground defensive positions were ready and waiting. For every strategy Ghazghkull employed, Yarrick had a counter ready. The two commanders became locked in a battle of wits that transcended the simple brutality of Orc warfare. Ghazghkull found himself frustrated in ways he had never experienced before. Here was a human who thought like an Orc, who understood greenskin psychology and tactics, who seemed to predict his moves before he made them. It was infuriating. It was challenging. It was, Ghazghkull had to admit, fun. The battle for Hive Hades escalated to the point where it became a personal matter for the Orc warlord. He wasn't just trying to conquer another hive. He was trying to prove his superiority over this one stubborn human who refused to recognize the inevitable. More and more resources were diverted to the Hades assault, pulling Orc forces away from other fronts. Ghazghkull even began claiming that Gork and Mork themselves were guiding his tactics. Though whether these divine messages were genuine or simply rationalization for his obsession remained unclear. The defenders of Hades fought with a fanaticism that matched anything the Orcs could muster. Under Yarrick's leadership, not a single soldier was executed for cowardice during the entire siege. There was no need. The Commissar inspired such loyalty and determination that retreat simply wasn't considered, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Yarrick himself was always at the front lines, fighting alongside his troops, demonstrating the kind of courage that legends are made of. The decisive moment came when Ghazghkull sent one of his strongest war bosses, Ugulhard, to deal with Yarrick personally. The massive Orc and his retinue broke through the outer defenses and confronted the Commissar in brutal close combat. Ugulhard's power claw severed Yarrick's right arm with a contemptuous swipe, a wound that would have killed most men through shock and blood loss alone. Yarrick refused to die. Through sheer force of will, he stayed conscious long enough to decapitate Ugulhard with his chainsword. Then, in a moment that would become legendary throughout both Imperial and Orc culture, he tore the power claw from Ugulhard's corpse and replaced his own severed arm with it. The weapon was far too large for a human to wield properly, powered by Orc technology that shouldn't work in human hands. But Yarrick made it work through conviction alone, or perhaps through the strange reality-warping effect of Orc beliefs. The Orcs believed the power claw was a fearsome weapon. Yarrick believed he could use it. In the presence of so many greenskins, which belief became reality. When Ghazghkull finally launched his personal assault on Hades' hive, the two commanders met face to face for the first time. The battle between them was brief but fierce, ending with Yarrick gravely wounded and Ghazghkull forced to withdraw when it became clear that his assault had failed. But something changed in that confrontation. Ghazghkull looked at the elderly human who had defied him for so long and felt something unusual for an Orc: respect. Here was a worthy opponent. Here was someone who understood that war was not just about winning or losing, but about the challenge itself, the test of strength and cunning against a foe of equal determination. Yarrick, through his stubborn defense of Hades' hive, had earned Ghazghkull's regard in a way no other human ever had. The stalemate at Hades bought crucial time for the Imperium's reinforcements to arrive. 3 Space Marine chapters, the Blood Angels, Salamanders, and Ultramarines, finally reached Armageddon, along with substantial Imperial Guard reinforcements. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels took personal command of the counteroffensive, immediately placing von Straub under arrest for his catastrophic mismanagement of the defense. The arrival of the Space Marines changed everything. These were the Emperor's finest post-human warriors, equipped with the best weapons and armor the Imperium could provide, led by commanders whose tactical genius had been honed over centuries of warfare. They deployed with devastating efficiency, establishing forward operating bases and launching surgical strikes against key Orc positions. Here Ghazghkull found himself fighting on two fronts, maintaining the siege of Hades while dealing with Space Marine assaults everywhere else. The Orcs began losing ground, driven back from the hives they had conquered. Tartarus Hive became the site of some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire war, with Orcs and Imperial forces clashing in hand-to-hand combat through the hive's countless corridors and chambers. The Orcs fought with desperate fury, using rocks and crude weapons when their ammunition ran out, but eventually they were overwhelmed. During the final assault on Tartarus, reports came in that Ghazghkull himself had fallen, struck down by a bolter round to his already damaged skull. His body was never found, leading Imperial commanders to cautiously celebrate what they believed was a decisive victory. The Orc invasion force, what without their charismatic leader, would fragment and could be eliminated piecemeal. This assessment was, once again, wrong. Ghazghkull hadn't died at Tartarus. He had recognized that the war was lost and made the difficult decision to retreat. This alone demonstrated his exceptional nature among Orc warlords. Most greenskins would rather die than abandon a fight, but Ghazghkull understood that sometimes retreat was the wiser option. He slipped away from Armageddon with his core followers, leaving the majority of his forces to buy time for his escape. The Second War for Armageddon officially ended with the fall of the last major Orc stronghold and the fragmentation of the remaining greenskin forces into manageable threats. The Imperium celebrated a hard-won victory. Armageddon had survived, though at tremendous cost. Millions were dead. Whole hive cities lay in ruins, and the planet's industrial output had been crippled. Commissar Yarrick was hailed as the hero of Armageddon, the man whose stubborn defense of Hades' hive had bought the time necessary for victory. He was offered retirement with full honors, a quiet end to a distinguished career. He refused. Yarrick had studied Ghazghkull's tactics throughout the war, had stared into the Orc warlord's eyes during their brief confrontation, and he knew with absolute certainty that this was not over. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka was still alive, still dangerous, and still pursuing whatever vision his Orc gods had shown him. Yarrick swore an oath to hunt down the beast of Armageddon and ensure he could never threaten the Imperium again, as it was a promise that would define the rest of his life and forge one of the strangest rivalries in Imperial history. The Old Commissar and the Orc Prophet, forever bound together by war and mutual respect, their fates intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. But that confrontation would have to wait. First, both warriors had unfinished business to attend to. The rival, Commissar Yarrick. To understand Ghazghkull's story, you must understand the man who became his greatest adversary and, in a strange way, his most valued opponent. Sebastian Yarrick was everything the Imperium claimed to represent: unwavering faith, iron discipline, tactical brilliance, and a will that could not be broken regardless of the odds arrayed against it. Born on an unremarkable world in the Segmentum Solar, Yarrick had joined the Schola Progenium as a child and been trained from an early age for service to the Emperor. He excelled in his studies, demonstrating not just the zealous devotion expected of all commissars, but also an unusual intellectual curiosity. While his peers focused solely on military doctrine and the punishment of cowards, Yarrick studied Xenos psychology, learning everything he could about humanity's enemies. This academic interest became specialized when, as a young commissar, he encountered an Orc raider during a minor incursion. Rather than simply executing the captured greenskin, Yarrick learned its language. He studied how Orcs thought, how they organized themselves, what motivated them beyond simple violence. His superiors considered this unusual, possibly even suspicious. But Yarrick's combat record was exemplary, and his loyalty beyond question. By the time he was assigned to Armageddon's planetary defense forces, Yarrick had become one of the Imperium's foremost experts on orc warfare. He understood that greenskins weren't mindless brutes, but operated according to their own internal logic. They valued strength and cunning. They respected bold action and despised weakness. They believed in their gods with a fervor that rivaled the most devoted Imperial saint. This knowledge made Yarrick far more dangerous to orcs than any ordinary commissar could be. His appearance was striking even before his augmentation. Tall and lean, with an angular face that rarely showed emotion, Yarrick carried himself with absolute confidence. His uniform was always immaculate. Yet his battered stormcoat, a symbol of countless battles, survived. He wore a peaked cap, adorned with the skull insignia of his office, and his bionic eye, a replacement for one lost in an early campaign, gave him a distinctly intimidating appearance. But it was during the Second War for Armageddon that Yarrick truly became legendary. His defense of Hades' hive was a masterclass in defensive warfare, combining careful preparation, tactical flexibility, and inspirational leadership. He didn't just command his troops, he fought alongside them, demonstrating the courage he demanded from others. When Ghazghkull severed his arm, the moment could have broken any normal commander. Instead, Yarrick turned it into a symbol of defiance. The image of the elderly commissar fighting with an oversized orc power claw welded to his stump became iconic throughout the Imperium. Here was a man who would literally tear weapons from enemy corpses and make them his own, rather than admit defeat. His confrontation with Ghazghkull during the siege created something unprecedented: mutual respect between an Imperial hero and an orc warlord. Yarrick recognized in Ghazghkull a level of strategic thinking that elevated the greenskin far above typical orc intelligence. And Ghazghkull saw in Yarrick a worthy opponent, someone who could match him in cunning and determination. This respect would define their relationship going forward. Among orcs, where might makes right and strength is the ultimate virtue, Yarrick earned a status no other human had achieved. But the greenskins gave him a nickname, Old One-Eye, referring to his bionic replacement. But they used it with something approaching admiration. Ghazghkull himself would later tell his followers that Yarrick knew how to fight like an orc, which was the highest compliment a greenskin could offer. After the Second War ended, Yarrick could have retired in glory. He was already ancient by human standards, his body scarred by decades of warfare, his bionic replacements more numerous than his original limbs. But retirement was never an option. He had seen the threat Ghazghkull represented, had witnessed firsthand the unprecedented strategic capability the orc prophet possessed. If left unchecked, this greenskin could unite the orc race in ways that would threaten the very survival of the Imperium. So Yarrick came out of his brief retirement and requested permission to form a military expedition specifically tasked with hunting down Ghazghkull and destroying his forces before they could threaten Imperial space again. His request was granted, and he was given command of a substantial fleet and army drawn from Armageddon's own regiments. These soldiers, who had fought under Yarrick during the siege of Hades, would follow him anywhere. The hunt took Yarrick across dozens of star systems, always following reports of orc activity, trying to predict where Ghazghkull would strike next. It was like tracking a particularly cunning animal, one that had learned to cover its tracks and disguise its movements. For 3 years, the commissar pursued his quarry without success, arriving at Worlds only to find that Ghazghkull had already moved on. The trail finally led to Golgotha, a resource-rich world that had recently been conquered by orcs. Intelligence suggested that Ghazghkull had established a base there and was consolidating his forces for another major offensive. Yarrick believed he finally had the orc warlord cornered. He committed his entire force to the assault, determined to end the threat once and for all. It was a trap. Ghazghkull had indeed established a base on Golgotha, but it was a facade designed to lure Yarrick into overextending his forces. Unknown to Imperial intelligence, a second, larger orc force had been deposited on the planet via Space Hulk and was waiting in underground cave complexes. when Yarek's army committed fully to the assault on Ghazghkull's visible base, whereas the hidden orcs emerged and caught the Imperial forces between hammer and anvil. The Battle of Golgotha was a disaster for the Imperium. Yarek's forces were surrounded, outmaneuvered, and systematically destroyed. The Commissar himself fought to the last, commanding his Baneblade, super-heavy tank in a desperate last stand, even as the orc horde closed in around him. He deliberately rammed one of Ghazghkull's gargants with his tank, destroying both vehicles in a massive explosion. Yarek survived the crash, but was badly wounded and unable to continue fighting. When Ghazghkull's warriors finally breached the wrecked Baneblade, they found the Commissar still alive, still defiant, preparing to fight even though he could barely move. Ghazghkull himself came to witness the capture of his worthy opponent. What happened next shocked everyone present. Rather than execute Yarek or parade him as a trophy, Ghazghkull ordered that the Commissar be kept alive and treated well. For weeks, Yarek was held prisoner aboard Ghazghkull's Space Hulk, subjected not to torture, but to something almost stranger: conversation. Ghazghkull would visit his prisoner regularly, and the two would talk about war, about strategy, about their respective philosophies of combat. During these conversations, Ghazghkull revealed his plans for the future. He was going to return to Armageddon. Not immediately, but when the time was right. He was going to launch an invasion that would make the Second War look like a minor skirmish. And he wanted Yarek to be there to oppose him, because a proper fight needed a proper opponent. And Yarek had proven himself the best human warrior Ghazghkull had ever faced. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Ghazghkull released him. He provided Yarek with a small shuttle, supplies, and a functioning navigation system, and let the Commissar go free. The official explanation was that Ghazghkull wanted Yarek to prepare Armageddon's defenses for the coming invasion, to make the eventual battle more challenging and therefore more satisfying. But there was more to it than that. In releasing Yarek, Ghazghkull was acknowledging their unique relationship. The Commissar wasn't just an enemy to be destroyed. He was a worthy opponent, someone who elevated warfare from simple slaughter to an art form. Keeping him alive, ensuring he would be present for future conflicts, was Ghazghkull's way of honoring that status. Yarek returned to Imperial space and reported everything Ghazghkull had told him. Most military commanders dismissed it as psychological warfare, an attempt to intimidate the Imperium with threats of future invasion. But Yarek knew better. He had looked into Ghazghkull's eyes, had heard the absolute certainty in the Orc prophet's voice. The threat was real, and it was only a matter of time before it materialized. The Commissar spent the next decades preparing, strengthening Armageddon's defenses, training new regiments, and establishing the infrastructure necessary to withstand a prolonged siege. He requisitioned additional weapons, fortified critical hive cities, and established supply lines that could sustain the planet, even if cut off from outside assistance. All the while, he watched the stars, waiting for the green tide to return. His obsession with defeating Ghazghkull became legendary throughout Imperial space. Other officers considered it unhealthy, a sign that the old Commissar had become too fixated on a single enemy. But Yarek understood what they didn't. Ghazghkull wasn't just another Orc warlord. He was a fundamental threat to Imperial security, a green-skinned leader who could think in centuries rather than moments, who could learn from defeat and adapt his strategies accordingly. The relationship between Yarek and Ghazghkull had become something unique in the annals of Imperial history. They were enemies, certainly, locked in a war that could only end with one or both of their deaths. But they were also, in their own way, kindred spirits. Two warriors who understood that war was not just about winning or losing, but about the challenge itself, the test of will and cunning against a worthy opponent. Ghazghkull had told Yarek during one of their conversations aboard the Space Hulk that the Commissar was too much fun to kill. This wasn't mockery. It was the highest compliment an Orc could offer, an acknowledgement that Yarek had achieved something no other human had. He had earned the respect of the prophet of Gork and Mork himself. And when Ghazghkull finally returned to Armageddon, Exactly 57 years to the day after his first invasion, Yarrick was ready and waiting. The stage was set for the greatest battle either warrior had ever known, a conflict that would determine not just the fate of Armageddon, but possibly the future of the entire Imperium. As Golgotha, the trap, and the release. After his withdrawal from Armageddon, Ghazghkull didn't simply disappear into the void. He had learned valuable lessons from his first major campaign, and like any good student of warfare, he set about analyzing what had gone wrong and how to improve. The Second War for Armageddon had been a defeat, certainly, but it had also been an education. Ghazghkull now understood how the Imperium would respond to a major Orc invasion. He knew their tactics, their strategies, their strengths and weaknesses. More importantly, he knew about Yarrick. The stubborn commissar had impressed Ghazghkull more than any opponent he had previously faced. Here was a human who thought like an Orc, who valued the challenge of combat as much as the victory itself. The idea that such a worthy opponent existed fascinated the Orc prophet in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Ghazghkull wanted to test himself against Yarrick again, to see if the commissar's defense of Hades' hive had been skill or merely luck. The world of Golgotha provided the perfect opportunity. It was a resource-rich planet in the Golgotha subsector, previously colonized by humanity, but long since conquered and reconquered by various Xenos species. Most recently, it had fallen into the hands of disparate Orc tribes who spent more time fighting each other than doing anything productive. For Ghazghkull, it represented exactly what he needed, a place to rebuild his forces and test new strategies away from Imperial oversight. Ghazghkull landed on Golgotha with only his most trusted warriors, a core force small enough to avoid immediate detection, but powerful enough to establish dominance. His approach was methodical. He didn't simply declare himself warlord and expect obedience. Instead, he began subjugating the local tribes one by one, starting with small warbands and working his way up to larger clans. His method was as much psychological as physical. Ghazghkull would challenge local bosses to single combat, and when he defeated them, which he always did, thanks to his combination of tactical genius and divinely augmented skull, he would offer them a choice: join his growing crusade and share in the glory to come, or continue their meaningless feuding until they all died forgotten and alone. Most chose to follow him. Those who didn't were eliminated as object lessons. Word spread quickly through the Orc population of Golgotha. A powerful warlord had arrived, one who claimed to speak with the direct authority of Gork and Mork, one whose adamantium skull and prophetic visions marked him as something special. Whole tribes began seeking out Ghazghkull voluntarily, eager to join what was clearly becoming a significant force. But Ghazghkull wasn't content with simply conquering Golgotha. He had a larger plan, one that would require patience and careful preparation. He knew that Yarrick would come looking for him eventually. The commissar had proven too stubborn to simply let his escape from Armageddon go unanswered. Ghazghkull decided to turn this inevitability into an opportunity. He ordered his forces to construct a base that would appear, from orbital reconnaissance, to be a major stronghold. Well, it needed to look like the kind of installation that a warlord preparing for a major offensive would establish. Defenses were erected, weapon emplacements installed, and supply depots positioned in ways that suggested this was Ghazghkull's command center. Meanwhile, secretly, he was arranging for a second force to be brought to Golgotha via Space Hulk and hidden in vast underground cave complexes that honeycombed the planet's crust. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. When Yarrick came, as Ghazghkull knew he would, the obvious target would be too tempting to ignore. The commissar would commit his forces to a direct assault on the visible base, believing he had finally cornered his prey. And then, the hidden army would emerge, catching the Imperial forces in a devastating pincer movement. True to Ghazghkull's prediction, Yarrick did come. 3 years after the end of the Second War for Armageddon, Imperial intelligence identified increased Orc activity in the Golgotha subsector and traced it to Ghazghkull's presence on the planet. Yarrick immediately requested permission to lead an expedition to eliminate the threat before it could grow into something unmanageable. The Commissar arrived at Golgotha with a substantial force. Multiple regiments of Imperial Guard, armored support, and even his personal Baneblade super-heavy tank, which had been recovered from Armageddon and restored to full functionality. He named it the Fortress of Arrogance, a deliberate taunt aimed at Ghazghkull's presumed pride. Yarek's initial survey of Golgotha confirmed what Imperial intelligence had suggested. Ghazghkull had indeed established a major base on the planet, as one that appeared to be the center of his operations. The defenses looked formidable, but not insurmountable, and the force concentration suggested this was where the Orc warlord was making his stand. To Yarek's credit, he approached the assault with appropriate caution. He didn't simply charge at the base with everything he had. Instead, he conducted reconnaissance, probed the defenses, and carefully positioned his forces for maximum effectiveness. But he was working with incomplete information, and Ghazghkull had anticipated every logical move the Commissar would make. When Yarek finally launched his assault, it initially went well. Imperial forces breached the outer defenses, destroyed the weapon emplacements, and began pushing toward the base's core. Ghazghkull even sacrificed his remaining Gargants in a flanking maneuver that appeared desperate but was actually designed to convince Yarek that the Orc warlord was running out of options. Then the trap sprung. The hidden Orc forces erupted from the underground caverns, emerging behind and around the Imperial positions in a coordinated assault that demonstrated shocking tactical sophistication. At the same time, Ghazghkull's Space Hulk appeared in orbit and engaged the Imperial Navy vessels that had been providing orbital support, driving them off and isolating Yarek's ground forces. The Imperial army found itself surrounded, cut off from reinforcement or retreat, facing an Orc force vastly larger than intelligence had suggested. Yarek realized immediately what had happened. He had been outmaneuvered by an Orc, something that should have been impossible but was becoming distressingly familiar where Ghazghkull was concerned. The Battle of Golgotha became a desperate fight for survival. Yarek ordered his forces into defensive positions and prepared for a siege, but without orbital support or resupply, it was only a matter of time before they would be overwhelmed. The Commissar himself took command of the Fortress of Arrogance, using the massive tank as a mobile command post and weapons platform. In a final desperate gambit, Yarek identified one of Ghazghkull's Gargants advancing on his position and ordered his driver to ram it. The Baneblade accelerated to maximum speed and slammed into the massive Orc war machine, the impact destroying both vehicles in a catastrophic explosion that could be seen from orbit. Yarek survived the crash, but was badly injured, trapped in the wreckage of his beloved tank as Orc warriors closed in. When Ghazghkull's boys finally cut through the wreckage and dragged the Commissar out, they found him still trying to fight, despite injuries that would have killed any normal human. Ghazghkull came personally to witness the capture of his worthy opponent, curious to see how Yarek would face defeat. What the Orc warlord saw impressed him greatly. Even broken and bleeding, Yarek met Ghazghkull's gaze with defiance, refusing to show fear or beg for mercy. Here was someone who understood that death in battle was not something to be feared, but accepted as the inevitable end of a warrior's path. Ghazghkull recognized in that moment that killing Yarek would be a waste of potential. Yarek was taken aboard Ghazghkull's Space Hulk and imprisoned, though his treatment was surprisingly humane by Orc standards. He was given medical attention sufficient to keep him alive, provided with adequate food and water, and left largely unmolested, except when Ghazghkull came to visit. These visits became a strange ritual. Ghazghkull would enter Yarek's cell and the two would talk, not as captor and prisoner, but almost as colleagues discussing their shared profession. They debated tactics, discussed past battles, and argued about military philosophy. Ghazghkull was genuinely curious about how humans thought, how they organized their armies, why they fought with such determination for an emperor they had never seen. Yarek, in turn, gained insights into Orc psychology that no Imperial scholar had ever achieved. During one of these conversations, Ghazghkull revealed his intentions. He was going to return to Armageddon. The Second War had been a learning experience, a chance to understand how the Imperium would respond to a major Orc invasion. Now that he understood their tactics and strategies, he would return with a force so overwhelming that no defense could stop it. And he wanted Yarrick there to oppose him. Yarrick, still recovering from his injuries, asked why. Why not simply kill him now and remove a capable enemy from the board? Ghazghkull's answer was surprisingly thoughtful for an orc. Because war without challenge was meaningless. Because victory against weak opponents proved nothing. Because the gods themselves demanded that great warriors test themselves against the strongest foes available. Yarrick was, in Ghazghkull's estimation, the strongest human warrior he had ever encountered. Killing him would be easy, but ultimately unsatisfying. Letting him live, allowing him to prepare Armageddon's defenses, ensuring that the coming battle would be as challenging as possible. That was the choice worthy of a prophet of Gork and Mork. After several weeks of captivity, Ghazghkull kept his word. He provided Yarrick with a shuttle, supplies, functioning navigation equipment, and let him go. The other orcs thought their warlord had gone mad. You didn't release dangerous enemies to fight another day. You killed them and moved on. But Ghazghkull was operating according to a logic that transcended normal orc thinking. He was planning not just for the next battle, but for the next war. And that war would be all the more glorious for having a worthy opponent to test himself against. Yarrick returned to Imperial space and immediately began preparing for the promised invasion. He knew with absolute certainty that Ghazghkull would keep his word. The orc prophet might be many things, but a liar wasn't one of them. When he said he would return to Armageddon, he meant it. The only question was when. The answer would come exactly 57 years after the Second War, for Armageddon ended. Ghazghkull had a sense for symbolic timing, and returning on the precise anniversary of his first invasion was exactly the kind of theatrical gesture that would appeal to both his divine mission and his developing sense of drama. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the galaxy would soon witness the largest orc invasion in Imperial history. Asil, led by a prophet who had learned from his failures and refined his strategies to near perfection. Armageddon would burn again, and this time, Ghazghkull intended to finish what he had started. The Third War for Armageddon. Return of the Beast. The decades between the Second and Third Wars for Armageddon were not spent in idleness. While Yarrick strengthened the planet's defenses and trained new generations of soldiers in the art of fighting orcs, Ghazghkull was engaged in his own preparations. His defeat in the Second War had taught him valuable lessons, and he intended to apply them with ruthless efficiency. One of the key problems Ghazghkull had identified was mobility. During the Second War, his forces had relied primarily on planetary landings, followed by ground assaults. This approach gave the defenders time to prepare, and allowed them to concentrate their forces at threatened points, and ultimately enabled the Space Marines to arrive and turn the tide. For his next invasion, Ghazghkull needed a way to bypass defensive concentrations and strike directly at key targets. The solution came in the form of an alliance with Nazdreg Ug Urdgrub, a Bad Moon's war boss, renowned for having the finest mech boys in the galaxy under his command. Nazdreg's technical specialists had perfected teleporter technology, devices that could transport orcs directly from orbiting ships to planetary surfaces, bypassing all the defensive layers that normally protected Imperial worlds. Ghazghkull approached Nazdreg with a proposal. Help him test and refine the teleporter technology, and in exchange, Nazdreg would have Ghazghkull's support in future campaigns. What the Bad Moons? Warboss agreed, and together they planned an assault on Piscina 4, a world in the Dark Angels chapter's recruiting territory. The attack would serve dual purposes: test the new technology in actual combat, and gather intelligence on Space Marine response times and tactics. The assault on Piscina 4 was a qualified success. The teleporters worked, allowing orc forces to materialize directly onto the planet's surface with minimal warning. The Dark Angels responded with characteristic efficiency, led at the time by Belial, who would later become Grand Master of the Deathwing. The Space Marines fought a desperate rearguard action, holding key positions until reinforcements could arrive, and ultimately drove the orcs from the planet. But Ghazghkull didn't care about holding Piscina 4. Yet he had learned what he needed to know. The teleporters were functional and could be deployed on a massive scale. Moreover, he had observed how the Dark Angels coordinated their defense, noted their response times, and identified vulnerabilities in their tactical doctrine. All of this information would be useful when facing Space Marines during his return to Armageddon. After Piscina 4, Ghazghkull began a series of smaller raids against Imperial worlds, each one designed to test specific aspects of his evolving strategy. The agri-world of Chigon 17 fell to a guerrilla campaign that overwhelmed static defenses through constant mobility and unpredictable attacks, while the Imperial Navy battlecruiser Radiant Way was captured through a combination of boarding actions and electronic warfare that demonstrated Ghazghkull's forces could compete even in void combat. Each raid taught new lessons, identified new weaknesses in Imperial defensive doctrine, and added more orcs to Ghazghkull's growing horde. Word was spreading throughout the greenskin populations of nearby sectors. The Prophet of Gork and Mork was gathering his forces, preparing for something big. Powerful war bosses, who would normally compete for dominance instead, pledged their allegiance to Ghazghkull, recognizing that he offered something no other orc could. A vision of conquest on a scale that would dwarf anything the orc race had achieved in living memory. But Ghazghkull's preparations went beyond simple military build-up. But he was also experiencing increasing visions from Gork and Mork, divine communications that grew more intense and painful with each passing year. Headaches plagued him constantly, so severe that even orc pain tolerance was tested. Grotznik performed multiple surgeries, adjusting the adamantium plates in Ghazghkull's skull, trying to relieve the pressure, but the visions only intensified. These visions showed Ghazghkull a galaxy consumed by endless war, with orcs united under a single banner fighting battles that would never end. They showed him leading a crusade so vast that the stars themselves would tremble before it. And they showed him Armageddon, the world that had defied him, burning under a green tide that could not be stopped as 998M41 approached. Ghazghkull's preparations reached their culmination. And he had assembled an invasion force unlike anything the Imperium had faced since the days of the Great Crusade. Over 50 cruisers, more than 300 escort vessels, at least 4 space hulks, and millions upon millions of orc warriors, all united under his command and burning with eagerness to prove themselves in the coming battle. On Armageddon, Yarrick watched the stars and waited. The planet's defenses had been massively upgraded since the Second War. New orbital platforms protected the approaches, naval stations had been established throughout the system, and the ground forces had been expanded and trained specifically for anti-orc warfare. Armageddon was now one of the most heavily fortified worlds in the entire Imperium, its defenses rivaling even those of Terra itself. It wouldn't be enough. On the day of the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, exactly 57 years to the day after the Second War began, Ghazghkull's fleet emerged from the warp. Augur psychic probes registered the massive disruption as hundreds of orc vessels tore their way back into real space, bringing with them the largest greenskin armada ever assembled. The monitor station Dante transmitted a desperate warning before being destroyed by the leading elements of the orc fleet. The Third War for Armageddon had begun. The initial void battle was a slaughter. The Imperial Navy defenders fought bravely, using every advantage their superior technology and training could provide, but they were simply overwhelmed by numbers. For every orc vessel destroyed, 3 more took its place. Kill cruisers made suicidal runs at Imperial capital ships, ramming them when their weapons failed. Space hulks plowed through defensive formations like battering rams, their sheer mass making them nearly unstoppable. Within hours, the Imperial Navy had been driven from Armageddon's orbit. The few surviving ships retreated to the outer system, regrouping and calling desperately for reinforcements. Ghazghkull's fleet established orbital supremacy and began the next phase of the invasion. But this time, there were no mass landings. Instead, Ghazghkull demonstrated the effectiveness of his new teleporter technology. Orc forces began materializing directly onto Armageddon's surface, bypassing all the carefully prepared orbital defenses. They appeared in hive cities, industrial complexes, military bases. anywhere that careful reconnaissance had identified as strategically valuable. Yarrick had anticipated this possibility and positioned rapid response forces to counter sudden incursions. But even his careful preparations couldn't cope with the sheer scale of the simultaneous attacks. It was like trying to plug holes in a dam that was failing everywhere at once. For every orc force that was contained or destroyed, 3 more appeared elsewhere. Then, Ghazghkull demonstrated the depth of his desire for revenge. Hades' hive, the city that had defied him during the Second War, the location of his greatest frustration and his first encounter with Yarrick, Ghazghkull destroyed it from orbit. A massive asteroid was launched from one of his space hulks, impacting the hive with the force of a nuclear weapon. The entire city was obliterated in seconds, millions of civilians dying before they even knew what had happened. It was a statement of intent and a demonstration of how thoroughly Ghazghkull had learned from his previous defeat. He would not make the same mistake twice. He would not become fixated on a single objective while losing sight of the larger strategic picture. Hades' hive had frustrated him before, so now it simply ceased to exist. Problem solved. Yarrick, to his credit, had anticipated even this. The old commissar understood Ghazghkull's psychology well enough to predict the orc warlord's desire to avenge his previous humiliation. Hades' hive had been evacuated weeks before the invasion began, its population relocated to other cities where they could contribute to the defense. The destruction of the hive was spectacular and terrible, but it claimed far fewer lives than Ghazghkull probably hoped. The war that followed was unlike anything the Imperium had experienced. This wasn't a traditional orc invasion, with predictable patterns and exploitable weaknesses. This was coordinated, sustained warfare, conducted with a level of strategic sophistication that seemed impossible for greenskins. Ghazghkull had learned to coordinate multiple army groups across vast distances, maintain supply lines, establish fortified positions, and adapt his tactics in response to Imperial counterattacks. The Imperium's response was equally unprecedented. Over 25 Space Marine chapters deployed to Armageddon, an assembly of the Emperor's finest that hadn't been seen since the Horus Heresy. Dozens of Imperial Guard regiments arrived from across the Segmentum Solar. Multiple Titan legions marched to war, their god machines shaking the earth with every step. The Sisters of Battle sent their own forces, adding faith and flame to the defense. Yarrick was appointed Supreme Commander of all Imperial forces on Armageddon, a position that granted him authority even over Space Marine chapter masters. It was an extraordinary recognition of his expertise and the trust the Imperium placed in his judgment. The old commissar coordinated the defense with the same meticulous care he had shown during the siege of Hades, positioning forces where they could do the most good, identifying and exploiting weaknesses in the orc advance, and maintaining morale even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The war raged across the entire planet. Hive cities became battlegrounds where every street was contested, every building fought over floor by floor. Yet the ash wastes saw massive tank battles as armored columns clashed in swirling dust storms. The equatorial jungles became hunting grounds where orc commandos and Imperial special forces engaged in deadly games of ambush and counter-ambush. Ghazghkull was everywhere and nowhere, coordinating his forces through a combination of personal appearances and psychic communication with his weird boys. He would appear at critical junctures, leading assaults that broke enemy lines or holding positions that seemed certain to fall. His presence alone was worth entire regiments, as orcs fought with redoubled fury when their prophet was watching. But even Ghazghkull's tactical genius had limits. The sheer scale of the defense, the determination of the Imperial forces, and the presence of so many Space Marines created a stalemate that even the largest orc invasion in history couldn't break. The war ground on month after month, year after year, consuming resources and lives in staggering quantities, but achieving no decisive victory for either side. This was when Ghazghkull's headaches and visions reached their peak. Gork and Mork were speaking to him constantly now, their divine voices so loud they sometimes drowned out the sounds of battle. They showed him visions of a greater destiny, a cosmic war that would dwarf even this massive conflict. They told him that Armageddon was no longer where he needed to be. Even Makari, Ghazghkull's faithful banner waver, who had been killed and reincarnated countless times, tried to talk his boss out of continuing the Armageddon campaign. The little Gretchen sensed that something had changed, that the gods wanted Ghazghkull elsewhere. For his impertinence, Makari was killed again, though he would be reincarnated shortly after. Then came the moment that changed everything. During a particularly intense battle, Ghazghkull was struck in the chest by a Laman Russ battle tank's main gun. The shot tore through his mega armor and blasted a hole clean through his torso, a wound that should have killed even an orc of his exceptional toughness. As Ghazghkull fell, bleeding and dying, Makari crawled into the tank and slaughtered its crew from the inside. As Ghazghkull recovered from his injuries, he realized that the incident had been a message from Gork and Mork. He had been wrong to ignore their visions. They were wrong to focus so completely on Armageddon when the gods had greater plans for him. He admitted this to Makari, acknowledged his error to Gork and Mork, and announced his intention to leave Armageddon behind. The orcs still on the planet would continue fighting. Orcs always fight. But Ghazghkull's personal mission lay elsewhere. He had a greater calling to fulfill, one that would require him to unite every orc in the galaxy under his banner. Armageddon had been a test, a proving ground where he had demonstrated his ability to lead the largest orc crusade in history. Now it was time to take what he had learned and apply it on a galactic scale. Ghazghkull left Armageddon aboard his Space Hulk, now renamed the Kill Wrecker, taking with him his core followers and leaving the rest of his forces to continue the war under the command of his subordinate war bosses. The third war for Armageddon would continue for years, ultimately ending in a stalemate that left both sides exhausted and Armageddon itself a scarred ruin. But Ghazghkull was no longer interested in that conflict. He had a new mission, one that would take him to the far corners of the galaxy and beyond. Gork and Mork had commanded him to unite the orc race, to gather every greenskin under a single banner, and to launch a crusade that would never end. And Ghazghkull, prophet and warlord, intended to do exactly that. The Great Vision. Messages from the gods. The pursuit began almost immediately. Yarrick, an understanding that Ghazghkull's departure from Armageddon represented both an opportunity and a threat, assembled a task force to hunt down the orc warlord before he could establish his next base of operations. He was joined by High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars, who had committed an entire crusade to the destruction of Ghazghkull's forces. The combined Imperial fleet was formidable, equipped with some of the fastest ships in the Imperium and crewed by veterans who had fought orcs for decades. They caught up to Ghazghkull's fleet in the Haunted Gulf, a region of dead space known for its strange energy phenomena and uncharted navigation hazards. It seemed like the perfect place to corner the fleeing orcs, to trap them against the cosmic anomalies and destroy them once and for all. But the battle that followed was one of the most intense void combats of the entire era. The Imperial Navy's superior speed and firepower tore through the orc fleet with devastating efficiency, destroying ship after ship in carefully coordinated volleys. Ghazghkull's forces fought back with typical orc ferocity, but even their legendary toughness couldn't overcome such a massive technological and tactical advantage. Aboard the Kill Wrecker, Ghazghkull watched his fleet being systematically destroyed and felt something unusual for an orc. Frustration mixed with a strange calm. He knew he was about to die. The Imperial forces had him cornered, his ships were being obliterated, and there was no escape. By any logical measure, this should have been the end of his story, the conclusion of the Prophet's great crusade before it could truly begin. Then Gork and Mork spoke to him again, but this time it was different. This wasn't a vision or a subtle nudge toward a particular course of action. This was direct communication, the twin gods of the orc race, speaking with such force and clarity that every weird boy aboard the Kill Wrecker began to convulse and scream. The message was simple, but absolute. It was not his time to die. Ghazghkull's body erupted with psychic energy. green lightning arcing from his adamantium skull and striking the weird boys around him. The unfortunate orc psychers were consumed by the overflow of divine power, their eyes bursting and skins sizzling as they became conduits for Gork and Mork's will. Through their dying screams, the gods delivered their commandment to all the orcs present. The whole galaxy would echo to the battle cry of the greenskins, and every orc in existence would be united under Ghazghkull's banner. But to accomplish this impossible task, he would first need to defeat every other major orc warlord and bring them into his great crusade. Only when the orc race was truly unified could they begin the eternal war that Gork and Mork demanded. As the divine message reached its conclusion, the Kill Wrecker vanished. Not through conventional warp travel, but through a direct intervention of the orc gods themselves. One moment, the massive space hulk was being battered by Imperial fire. The next, it had simply ceased to exist in that location. It reappeared light years away, deep in the Orc Empire of Octarius, leaving the pursuing Imperial forces staring at empty space where their target had been. Yarrick and Helbrecht could only watch in frustration as their prey escaped through what could only be described as divine intervention. The old commissar, ever practical, immediately began analyzing what had happened and planning his next move. But even he had to admit that hunting someone who had the direct protection of their gods was going to be more challenging than anticipated. Ghazghkull, for his part, found himself in Octarius with a new sense of purpose. His headaches had subsided, replaced by a crystal-clear understanding of what Gork and Mork wanted from him. No more fixating on single objectives like Armageddon. No more small-scale wars against the Imperium. His mission was bigger than that. He needed to unite every orc in the galaxy, forge them into a unified force, and lead them in a war that would literally never end. Whilst the first step was establishing his dominance over the orc forces already in Octarius. At the time of his arrival, the sector was ruled by various war bosses who had risen to power after previous leaders had left to join the fighting on Armageddon. The current dominant figure was Zog Steeltooth, a Deathskull warlord who had claimed the title of Overfiend after the previous leader had departed. Ghazghkull didn't ask permission or negotiate. He simply announced that he was taking over, backed by his reputation and the divine mandate he claimed. Most of the local war bosses fell in line immediately, recognizing that opposing the prophet of Gork and Mork was likely to be both futile and fatal. Those who challenged him were defeated in single combat, their forces absorbed into Ghazghkull's growing army. But the real threat in Octarius wasn't other orcs, it was the Tyranids. Octarius, war without end. The Octarius War had been raging for years before Ghazghkull arrived, a conflict so vast and consuming that it had become a self-sustaining cycle of violence. The war's origins lay in the machinations of Inquisitor Lord Fidus Cryptman, who had deliberately engineered a Tyranid invasion of the orc-held Octarius system as a way to slow Hive fleet Leviathan's advance toward Imperial space. The plan had worked, in a sense. A massive tendril of Leviathan had been drawn into Octarius by the psychic signature of billions of orcs, and the two species had been locked in combat ever since. But Cryptman's scheme had also created a problem that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Both orcs and Tyranids thrived on warfare. The more they fought, the stronger they became. Orcs grew larger and more aggressive when constantly battling, while Tyranids adapted and evolved in response to every new challenge. By the time Ghazghkull arrived, the war had reached a critical juncture. The Tyranids were slowly gaining the upper hand, their superior adaptability allowing them to counter orc tactics faster than the greenskins could develop new ones. The Overfiend of Octarius had been killed by the Swarmlord, Leviathan's greatest tactical organism, and the orc forces were beginning to fragment as various war bosses competed to replace him. Ghazghkull saw opportunity in this chaos. Here was the largest concentration of orcs outside of Armageddon, locked in an eternal war against an enemy that would never stop coming. It was exactly the kind of conflict that Gork and Mork would appreciate. and it provided the perfect proving ground for his mission to unite the Orc race. His arrival electrified the Orc forces in Octarius. Here was the prophet himself, the legendary warlord who had fought 2 wars on Armageddon and survived encounters with the greatest heroes of the Imperium. His very presence was a rallying cry, a signal that the tide was about to turn. Orcs from light years around began converging on Octarius, drawn by the psychic beacon of Ghazghkull's presence and the promise of the greatest fight in the galaxy. Ghazghkull didn't waste time with politics or maneuvering for position. He immediately threw himself into the war against the Tyranids, leading assaults on their strongest positions and demonstrating the tactical genius that had made him legendary. And he understood instinctively what many of the local war bosses had failed to grasp. You couldn't fight Tyranids the way you fought other enemies. They adapted too quickly, learned too fast. You had to keep changing your tactics, stay unpredictable, hit them in ways they couldn't anticipate. Under Ghazghkull's leadership, the Orc forces in Octarius began to coordinate in ways they never had before. Different tribes that would normally compete with each other instead worked together, recognizing that survival against the Tyranid horde required unity. War bosses, who would normally fight to the death over matters of pride, instead followed Ghazghkull's strategic direction, trusting in his divine mandate and proven track record. The war intensified to levels that defied comprehension. Entire worlds in the Octarius sector became battlegrounds where millions died every day. The Tyranids threw wave after wave of bioforms at the Orc positions, each generation incorporating new adaptations designed to counter greenskin tactics. The Orcs responded with their own innovations, mech boys working overtime to create new weapons and vehicles capable of dealing with evolved Tyranid organisms. Then came the incident that would become legendary throughout both Orc and Imperial accounts of the war. During a particularly intense engagement, Ghazghkull was swallowed whole by a Morlock, one of the Tyranids' massive burrowing creatures. The beast had emerged from underground, directly beneath the Orc warlord, its jaws closing around him before anyone could react. For most beings, this would have been an instant death sentence. The Morlock's digestive acids were powerful enough to dissolve ceramite armor, and its internal anatomy was specifically designed to crush and process prey. But Ghazghkull was not most beings. He was the prophet of Gork and Mork, protected by divine favor and armored in faith as much as adamantium. Inside the Morlock, Ghazghkull activated his power claw and began cutting his way out. The creature's internal organs were shredded as the Orc warlord carved a path through its body from the inside. Digestive acids that should have dissolved him instead barely scarred his mega armor. The Morlock's death throes were spectacular, the massive creature writhing in agony as Ghazghkull literally tore it apart from within. When he finally emerged, covered in ichor and roaring a challenge to any Tyranid that dared approach, the sight energized the Orc forces across the entire battlefield. Here was proof that their prophet was truly blessed by the gods, that no enemy could stand against him, not even the great devourer itself. The Orcs' battle cry echoed across Octarius, and they threw themselves at the Tyranids with redoubled fury. But Ghazghkull didn't emerge unscathed. The Morlock's acid had left burns across his body, and one of the creature's internal spikes had impaled him, the jagged barb so deeply embedded that teams of knobs and even a tractor beam couldn't remove it. It took a buzzsaw and a deft dread with magna clamps to finally extract the spike, and even Ghazghkull's legendary constitution required time to recover from such a serious injury. The incident taught both sides valuable lessons. What the Tyranids learned that even their most powerful bioforms couldn't reliably kill Ghazghkull, that attacking him directly was likely to result in catastrophic losses. They began avoiding direct confrontations with the Orc prophet, focusing instead on eliminating his subordinates and isolating him from the main Orc forces. Ghazghkull learned that even divine protection had its limits. He had survived the Morlock, but it had been close, closer than he cared to admit. The experience reinforced what Gork and Mork had been telling him. His destiny lay beyond Octarius. This war, as glorious as it was, wasn't his ultimate purpose. So Ghazghkull did what he had done on Armageddon. He left. Not permanently, and not in defeat, but strategically. He established himself as the undisputed leader of the Orc forces in Octarius, while united the various war bosses under his banner, and then moved on to the next challenge. The war in Octarius would continue. It would always continue, as Orcs and Tyranids poured more and more forces into the meat grinder. But Ghazghkull no longer needed to be physically present to maintain his influence. He had proven his point. The prophet of Gork and Mork could unite even the most fractious Orc tribes, could lead them to victory against the galaxy's most terrifying enemies, could survive encounters that should have been impossible. Now it was time to take that proven capability and apply it on a galactic scale. The pattern was set. Ghazghkull would travel to concentrations of Orc forces throughout the galaxy, defeat or co-opt the local war bosses, unite them under his banner, and move on to the next challenge. Each successful campaign added more greenskins to his growing crusade. Each victory reinforced his claim of divine mandate. Each demonstration of tactical genius attracted more followers, eager to be part of something greater than themselves. Reports began reaching Imperial intelligence of a massive Orc buildup, unprecedented in scale and coordination. Multiple sectors reported increased greenskin activity, but unlike previous Orc invasions, these forces weren't fragmenting into feuding tribes. They were organized, coordinated, and all seemed to be following the same strategic direction. Analysis suggested that Ghazghkull was attempting to do what every previous Orc warlord had failed to achieve: unite the entire Orc race under a single banner. If he succeeded, the implications were terrifying. The Orc species represented one of the largest population groups in the galaxy, outnumbering humanity by a significant margin. They were scattered across thousands of worlds, from small tribes to massive empires, but they had never been unified. Their tendency to fight each other as readily as they fought other species had always prevented them from becoming an existential threat. But Ghazghkull was changing that fundamental dynamic. For the first time in galactic history, the Orcs had a leader who could think strategically across decades and centuries, who could maintain focus on a goal beyond the next battle, who had the vision and charisma to unite even the most independent-minded war bosses. And he was doing it. Slowly, inexorably, Ghazghkull was gathering the green tide, preparing for the great crusade that Gork and Mork had shown him in his visions. The galaxy itself seemed to sense the growing threat, as astropaths reported disturbing dreams of a green fire consuming the stars, of wars that would never end, of the Orc gods themselves preparing to tear their way into reality. The Imperium prepared as best it could, but how do you prepare for a threat that encompasses billions of warriors spread across the entire galaxy? How do you stop a leader who has divine protection and learns from every defeat? How do you fight an enemy whose very existence grows stronger through conflict? These were questions that military planners would struggle with in the years to come. But one thing was certain: Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of Gork and Mork, the beast of Armageddon, yet was far from finished with his great work. And when that work was complete, when every Orc in the galaxy marched under his banner, the green tide would sweep across the stars in a war that would make all previous conflicts seem like minor skirmishes. The galaxy was about to discover what happens when the Orcs stop fighting each other and focus all their attention on everyone else. The nature of the beast. Understanding Ghazghkull. What makes Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka different from every other Orc warlord in galactic history? It's a question that has obsessed Imperial strategists, xenobiologists, and military theorists since his first appearance on the galactic stage. Understanding the answer requires looking beyond the surface-level attributes: his physical strength, his impressive arsenal, his tactical acumen, and examining the fundamental ways in which he defies every assumption the Imperium has made about orc psychology and capability. At the most basic level, Ghazghkull is extraordinarily intelligent for an orc. Most greenskins possess a kind of cunning that allows them to survive in their brutal society, but genuine strategic thinking is rare. Orcs live in the moment, concerned with the battle they're currently fighting, rather than wars they might wage in the future. Ghazghkull transcends this limitation. He thinks in decades and centuries, plans campaigns that unfold across multiple star systems, and demonstrates the kind of long-term strategic vision that's more commonly associated with human generals or elder farses. This intelligence manifests in his tactical flexibility. Where most orc warlords have a preferred style of warfare and stick to it regardless of circumstances, Ghazghkull adapts. He learned from his defeat on Armageddon, identified the weaknesses in his approach, and spent decades developing solutions. He studied Imperial defensive doctrines and found ways to counter them. He recognized that traditional orc tactics of overwhelming frontal assault, while often effective, were predictable and could be countered by prepared defenders. His adoption of teleporter technology exemplifies this adaptive thinking. Most orc war bosses would never consider relying on such complex machinery, preferring the straightforward approach of direct assault. But Ghazghkull recognized that mobility and surprise were force multipliers, that the ability to bypass defensive lines and strike directly at key objectives could offset the Imperium's technological advantages. He sought out Nazdreg and his mech boys, specifically to gain access to this technology, demonstrating both strategic foresight and the willingness to collaborate with other orcs to achieve his goals. Ghazghkull's psychic abilities also set him apart from typical orc warlords. The visions he receives from Gork and Mork are not simple hallucinations or the ravings of a damaged mind. Whether one interprets them as genuine divine communication or as manifestations of his own latent psychic potential, accessing the orc gestalt consciousness, the result is the same. Ghazghkull receives information and insights that allow him to make decisions with an almost prophetic quality. These visions give him a sense of timing that borders on the supernatural. The fact that he returned to Armageddon exactly 57 years after his first invasion wasn't coincidence. The number had symbolic significance, and Ghazghkull understood that symbols have power, especially among orcs. By returning on the precise anniversary, he reinforced his image as someone chosen by the gods, someone operating according to a divine plan rather than random circumstance. His equipment reflects both his status and his tactical sophistication. Mork's Roar, his personal weapon, is a massive 4-barreled cannon that should by all rights run out of ammunition within minutes of sustained fire. But through a combination of orc psychic field manipulation and sheer belief, the weapon never runs dry. Ghazghkull believes it has infinite ammunition. And in the reality-warping presence of so many orcs, belief becomes fact. His power claw, Gork's Claw, is similarly enhanced by the collective belief of his followers. It's larger and more powerful than standard orc power claws, capable of tearing through tank armor with contemptuous ease. When Ghazghkull crushed the Bloodthirster during his battle at the Warp Rift on the Space Hulk, it wasn't just physical strength that achieved victory. It was the absolute conviction that he was protected by Gork and Mork, backed by the psychic weight of thousands of orcs who believed the same thing. His mega armor represents the pinnacle of orc engineering, cobbled together from salvaged tank armor and mounted on a powered exoskeleton that gives him phenomenal strength. While the armor makes him slower and less maneuverable than lighter-equipped orcs, as this weakness is offset by mega boosters that increase the available power to the suit. The result is a walking fortress, nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons and capable of shrugging off hits that would destroy lesser warriors. But perhaps the most important piece of Ghazghkull's equipment is the least obviously martial, his boss pole. Topped with a massive horned skull, it serves as a rallying point for nearby orcs, a visual reminder of who's in charge and what they're fighting for. The skull itself may be from a beast Ghazghkull killed at some point in his career, a trophy that demonstrates his prowess and reinforces his status as a hunter of legendary prey. His physical appearance has become iconic throughout both Imperial and Orc culture. The adamantium plates in his skull gleam in battle, and a constant reminder of the injury that should have killed him, but instead unlocked his destiny. His bionic eye, though perpetually out of focus, sees across multiple spectrums and may feature built-in targeting systems and auto-sensors. His massive frame, already large for an orc, has grown even bigger through constant warfare, as greenskins naturally increase in size when regularly fighting. But all of these physical and technological attributes, impressive as they are, don't fully explain what makes Ghazghkull exceptional. The real difference lies in his psychology, his worldview, his understanding of what it means to be an orc, and what the orc race could achieve if properly unified. Most orc war bosses see warfare as an end in itself. You fight because fighting is what orcs do. You conquer because conquering proves your strength, yet you kill your enemies because that's the natural order of things. There's no deeper meaning, no greater purpose beyond the immediate satisfaction of violence. Ghazghkull sees warfare as a means to an end. He fights not just for the sake of fighting, but to achieve specific objectives that advance his larger goals. He conquers not just to prove his strength, but to gather the resources and followers necessary for his divine mission. He kills his enemies when necessary, but recognizes that sometimes letting them live serves his purposes better. This is most clearly demonstrated in his relationship with Yarrick. Any other orc warlord would have killed the commissar when given the opportunity. Yarrick was a dangerous enemy, responsible for the defeat at Hades' Hive and the ultimate failure of the Second War for Armageddon. What by every normal measure of orc behavior, he should have been executed as a trophy and a warning to other humans. But Ghazghkull understood something that other orcs didn't. A worthy opponent makes you stronger. Challenging fights improve your skills. Testing yourself against the best the enemy has to offer proves your superiority far more effectively than crushing weaklings. Yarrick alive and preparing Armageddon's defenses made for a much better war than Yarrick dead, and the planet defended by incompetents like von Strab. This understanding of the value of worthy opposition extends to Ghazghkull's treatment of other orc warbosses. Where many leaders would see potential rivals that needed to be eliminated, Ghazghkull sees valuable subordinates who can be convinced to join his cause. He doesn't automatically kill every boss who challenges him. Instead, he defeats them and then offers them a place in his grand crusade. Most accept, recognizing that serving a warlord who's going to unite the entire orc race offers more opportunities for glorious battle than remaining independent. His relationship with Makari, his banner waver, also demonstrates this unusual psychology. In orc society, Gretchen are expendable servants, barely worth noticing except as targets for abuse or ammunition for shock attack guns. Yet Ghazghkull maintains a consistent relationship with his banner waver, even going so far as to have Makari reincarnated whenever he dies. Whether this is genuine reincarnation, or simply Ghazghkull designating a new Gretchen as Makari is debatable, but the point remains. The Orc prophet values consistency and continuity in ways that other greenskins simply don't. There's also evidence that Ghazghkull experiences something approaching genuine religious faith, rather than the casual belief in Gork and Mork that most orcs demonstrate. When he speaks of his visions, there's a conviction in his voice that goes beyond simple claims of divine favor. He truly believes that the orc gods speak to him, that they have chosen him for a specific purpose, that his mission is cosmically important rather than just personally aggrandizing. This faith gives him a kind of moral certainty that's unusual in orc culture. He doesn't question whether he's doing the right thing because the gods themselves have told him what to do. This removes doubt and hesitation from his decision-making process, is allowing him to commit fully to his chosen course of action without second-guessing or wavering. At the same time, Ghazghkull has demonstrated the ability to admit when he's wrong and adjust his approach accordingly. After being wounded on Armageddon and recognizing it as a message from Gork and Mork, he admitted his error to both Makari and the gods. This willingness to acknowledge mistakes is extraordinarily rare among orcs. who typically blame failures on everything except their own decisions. But Ghazghkull's faith allows him this flexibility. If the gods say he was wrong, then he was wrong, and there's no shame in admitting it and correcting course. His impact on other orcs cannot be overstated. Wherever Ghazghkull goes, the local greenskin population becomes more organized, more focused, more dangerous. Well, this isn't just because of his personal combat prowess or tactical genius, it's because he provides something that orcs normally lack, a unifying vision that transcends immediate gratification. Orcs who follow Ghazghkull aren't just fighting for the next battle. They're part of something bigger, a grand crusade that will unite their entire species and unleash a war that will never end. This gives their lives meaning beyond simple survival and violence. They're not just warriors, they're crusaders in service to a divine mission. This psychological transformation makes them far more dangerous than ordinary orcs, because they're fighting for something they believe in, rather than just fighting because it's what they do. The fact that Ghazghkull can inspire this transformation across millions of orcs, and can maintain it over decades and centuries, can keep disparate tribes focused on a common goal, despite all the natural centrifugal forces of orc society. This is perhaps his greatest achievement and his most terrifying quality. He's not just a military leader. He's a prophet, a religious figure who has given the orc race something it never had before, a sense of destiny and purpose. And he's not finished. Every battle teaches him new lessons. Every campaign adds to his growing legend. Every war boss who swears allegiance brings more orcs under his banner. Slowly, inexorably, Ghazghkull is achieving what Gork and Mork commanded, the unification of the orc race under a single leader, preparing for the great crusade that will drown the galaxy in green fire. The Imperium has produced countless heroes over its 10,000-year history, as Space Marine chapter masters whose tactical genius has saved entire sectors, Imperial Guard generals whose campaigns have crushed alien empires, commissars whose leadership has turned certain defeat into miraculous victory. But none of them have faced an enemy quite like Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, because Ghazghkull is something new in galactic history. An orc who thinks like a human but fights like a greenskin, combining the strategic sophistication of the Imperium's best commanders with the raw physical power and psychic potential of the orc race. He is, in every sense, the perfect enemy, strong enough to threaten entire worlds, smart enough to outmaneuver prepared defenses, charismatic enough to unite fractious tribes, faithful enough to maintain focus on goals that span centuries, and protected by the favor of gods who may actually exist and intervene on his behalf. Understanding Ghazghkull means understanding that the orc threat has fundamentally changed. This isn't a temporary invasion that will burn itself out when the warlord is killed. This is a sustained, coordinated, long-term campaign of conquest being waged by someone who learns from every defeat and adapts to every challenge. The old Imperial strategies for dealing with orcs, wait for them to fragment, pick off the pieces, move on to the next crisis, no longer apply. The Beast of Armageddon, the Prophet of Gork and Mork, has changed the game, and the galaxy is still struggling to understand the implications of that change. The Great Crusade, uniting the Green Tide. In the current era of Warhammer 40,000's timeline, Ghazghkull's great work continues. After leaving Octarius and establishing his dominance over the orc forces there, he set out on a journey that would take him to every major concentration of greenskins in the galaxy. His mission, as commanded by Gork and Mork, was clear: defeat every significant orc warlord, bring them into his crusade, and unite the orc race under a single banner. This task would have seemed impossible to anyone else, even other orcs. The greenskin species is scattered across thousands of worlds, organized into countless tribes and empires, each led by war bosses who consider themselves the biggest and strongest. Orcs don't naturally unite under distant leaders. They follow whoever's physically present and can prove their dominance through direct combat. The idea of maintaining a unified command structure across multiple sectors was contrary to everything in orc nature. But Ghazghkull had advantages that other would-be unifiers lacked. First, his reputation had spread throughout the entire orc population. Every greenskin in the galaxy had heard of the prophet of Gork and Mork, the warlord who had fought 2 wars on Armageddon and survived encounters with the Imperium's greatest heroes. His legend preceded him, making local war bosses more amenable to joining his cause rather than opposing it. Second, his divine mandate gave him authority that transcended normal orc hierarchy. He wasn't just another war boss claiming to be the biggest and strongest. He was someone chosen by the gods themselves, marked by visions and miracles that proved his special status. For orcs, and who believe in Gork and Mork with genuine fervor, this spiritual authority carried tremendous weight. Third, Ghazghkull had developed a system for maintaining control over distant forces, even when he wasn't physically present. He would arrive at a concentration of orcs, defeat or co-opt the local leadership, unite them under his banner, and then appoint trusted subordinates to maintain order while he moved on to the next target. These subordinates weren't just random knobs. They were orcs who shared Ghazghkull's vision, who understood that they were part of something bigger than themselves, who could be trusted to maintain discipline and focus even without the prophet's direct oversight. Fourth, he used his psychic abilities to maintain a kind of spiritual connection with his far-flung forces. Ghazghkull could sense major concentrations of orcs across vast distances, allowing him to identify where his presence was most needed. He could communicate with his weird boys through the orc gestalt field, sending messages and receiving reports even across light years of distance. This psychic network, crude and unreliable by the standards of more sophisticated races, nevertheless gave Ghazghkull a level of command and control that no previous orc warlord had achieved. The results of this campaign have been dramatic. Reports reaching Imperial intelligence suggest that formerly independent orc empires are now coordinating their activities in ways that indicate a single controlling intelligence. Raids that would previously have been random and opportunistic now follow patterns, suggesting strategic planning. In orc forces that encounter Imperial resistance don't simply bash their heads against prepared defenses until they win or die. They probe for weaknesses, attempt flanking maneuvers, and sometimes even withdraw to regroup and try different approaches. This evolution in orc behavior represents a fundamental shift in the threat they pose. Individual orc raids have always been dangerous, but they were manageable because greenskins could be relied upon to fight in predictable ways. Now, with Ghazghkull's influence spreading across the orc population, that predictability has vanished. Imperial forces preparing to defend against a greenskin assault can no longer assume their enemies will follow standard orc tactics. They have to prepare for an enemy that might employ sophisticated strategies, might coordinate with other orc forces, might even attempt to outmaneuver rather than simply overpower. The threat is particularly acute because orcs reproduce through spores that are released constantly throughout their lives and in massive quantities when they die. Every orc killed in battle seeds the ground with spores that will eventually grow into new orcs. This means that battlefields become sites of future orc infestations, turning every Imperial victory into a potential future problem. Normally, this is manageable because newly spawned orcs lack the organization and leadership to pose immediate threats. But in a galaxy where Ghazghkull's influence is spreading, those feral orcs might be recruited into his crusade, given direction and purpose, turned from a nuisance into a genuine military threat. Some Imperial strategists have compared Ghazghkull's current campaign to the War of the Beast, a catastrophic orc invasion during the 32nd Millennium that nearly destroyed the Imperium. That ancient conflict was led by an orc leader, simply known as the Beast, whose tactical genius and ability to unite greenskin forces bore striking similarities to Ghazghkull's methods. The Beast had brought the orc race to the brink of total galactic dominance before being defeated through a combination of Imperial heroism and internal orc power struggles. The comparison is apt, but also terrifying, because Ghazghkull has already demonstrated capabilities that match or exceed what the Beast achieved. And unlike that ancient warlord, Ghazghkull has the benefit of learning from the failures of his predecessors. He knows how the Imperium defeated the beast. He knows the mistakes that ancient warlord made, and he's adjusting his strategies to avoid repeating those errors. There's also a question about whether Ghazghkull is actually a reincarnation of the beast, or perhaps a manifestation of the same spiritual entity that empowered that ancient warlord. Some Eldar Farseers have suggested that beasts never die, they are only banished, implying that the beast's essence survived its physical death and has now returned in Ghazghkull. Whether this is literally true or simply metaphorical, the implication is clear. Ghazghkull represents a threat on the same scale as the worst orc invasion in Imperial history, and possibly greater given his demonstrated learning capacity and strategic sophistication. The Imperium's response to this growing threat has been hampered by the fact that Ghazghkull doesn't present a single concentrated target that can be engaged and destroyed. He's constantly moving, appearing at different concentrations of orcs across the galaxy, uniting them and moving on before Imperial forces can respond. By the time a military expedition is organized to deal with his presence in one sector, he's already departed for another. Yarrick continues to pursue his nemesis with single-minded determination, but even the legendary Commissar has struggled to predict Ghazghkull's movements. The Orc Prophet seems to operate according to a logic that transcends normal strategic thinking, guided by visions that show him where he needs to be and when. This makes him nearly impossible to trap or corner, and as his movements appear random to outside observers, even though they follow a pattern that makes perfect sense to Ghazghkull himself. Meanwhile, the green tide continues to grow. More and more orcs are being drawn into Ghazghkull's Great Crusade, united by a vision of eternal warfare that appeals to the fundamental nature of their species. The Great Crusade that Gork and Mork showed Ghazghkull in his visions is slowly becoming reality, and the Imperium seems powerless to stop it. Some have suggested that the only way to defeat Ghazghkull is to kill him before he completes his mission of uniting the orc race. But this strategy has proven difficult to implement. Ghazghkull has survived assassination attempts, orbital bombardments, close combat with Space Marine heroes, and direct intervention by Yarrick himself. His divine protection, whether literal or the result of orc psychic belief made manifest, seems to render him nearly invulnerable. And even if he could be killed, there's no guarantee that his death would stop the crusade he's started. He's already inspired millions of orcs with his vision. That inspiration would survive his physical death and might even be strengthened by martyrdom. Others have proposed trying to fragment the orc forces by creating internal conflicts. But Ghazghkull's religious authority makes this approach challenging. His claim of divine mandate is backed by too many apparent miracles, too much demonstrated success for other orcs to credibly challenge it. War bosses who might normally compete for dominance instead fall in line behind the prophet, recognizing that opposing someone blessed by Gork and Mork is both futile and likely to end badly. The grim reality is that the Imperium may simply have to accept Ghazghkull as a permanent threat, like the Tyranids or Chaos, something to be contained rather than eliminated. Forces will need to be permanently allocated to watching for orc build-ups and responding before they can grow too large. Defensive positions will need to be maintained at unprecedented levels of readiness. Resources will need to be diverted from other critical needs to address the growing greenskin menace. And all the while, Ghazghkull continues his work. He travels from world to world, battle to battle, constantly expanding his influence and gathering more forces under his banner. He fights not just to win individual engagements, but to prove his divine mandate, and to demonstrate that following him leads to glorious warfare against worthy opponents. Every victory attracts more followers. Every demonstration of tactical genius reinforces his reputation. Every apparent miracle confirms that Gork and Mork truly do favor him above all other orcs. The Great Crusade is not yet complete. Ghazghkull has not yet succeeded in uniting every orc in the galaxy under his banner. but he's closer to that goal than any warlord before him, and the gap continues to narrow. What happens when he finally achieves his objective? When every greenskin in the galaxy acknowledges him as the prophet of Ghork and Mork and prepares to march under his command? The Imperium may not have to wait much longer to find out. And when that day comes, the galaxy will face a threat unlike anything it has seen in millennia. A unified orc race, billions strong, led by a tactical genius who has divine protection and learns from every defeat. The green tide will sweep across the stars, and nothing will ever be the same. Conclusion: The Prophet's Shadow. The story of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka is far from over. As we conclude this examination of the most dangerous orc in the galaxy, it's important to understand that everything we've discussed represents not an ending, but a beginning. Ghazghkull's great work continues, his crusade expands, and his influence over the orc race grows stronger with each passing year. To fully appreciate the magnitude of the threat he represents, consider what he has already accomplished. He has led 2 massive invasions of Armageddon, one of the most heavily defended worlds in the Imperium. He has survived encounters with some of humanity's greatest heroes, including multiple Space Marine chapter masters and the legendary Commissar Yarrick. He has united disparate orc tribes across multiple sectors, forging them into a coordinated force that operates with unprecedented strategic cohesion. He has been swallowed by a tyrannid biobeast and cut his way out. He has fought demons aboard a space hulk and literally headbutted a warp rift closed. He has earned the respect of his enemies and the fanatical devotion of his followers. These are not the accomplishments of an ordinary warlord. They are the deeds of someone who has transcended the normal limitations of their species, someone who has been touched by forces beyond mortal understanding and emerged transformed. Or whether one interprets this as literal divine intervention or as the manifestation of extraordinary psychic potential awakened by trauma, the result is the same. Ghazghkull has become something new, something unprecedented in orc history. His impact on the Warhammer 40,000 setting cannot be overstated. He represents a fundamental evolution in the orc threat, transforming what was previously a manageable nuisance into an existential danger. The scattered, feuding tribes of greenskins that the Imperium had learned to contain and control are being forged into a unified force under inspired leadership. The predictable tactics that Imperial commanders had come to expect from orc invasions have been replaced by sophisticated strategies that demonstrate genuine military genius. More importantly, a Ghazghkull has given the orc race something it never had before, a sense of destiny and purpose. Orcs have always fought, but they fought because fighting was what orcs did, not because they were working toward any particular goal. Ghazghkull has changed that. Under his leadership, orcs fight not just for the joy of combat, but as part of a grand crusade that will unite their species and unleash a war that will literally never end. This psychological transformation makes them far more dangerous than they were before, because they're no longer just seeking the next battle. They're building towards something greater. The relationship between Ghazghkull and Yarrick stands as one of the most fascinating dynamics in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore. 2 warriors from completely different species and cultures, bound together by mutual respect and an understanding that transcends normal enemy relationships. They are adversaries who push each other to greatness, each one making the other more dangerous through their opposition. Ghazghkull respects Yarrick as the worthiest human opponent he's ever faced. Yarrick understands Ghazghkull as the most dangerous orc who has ever lived. Their rivalry has defined both their lives and will likely determine how their stories end. The parallels to the Beast, the ancient orc warlord who nearly destroyed the Imperium during the 32nd Millennium, are impossible to ignore. Both demonstrated tactical genius far beyond normal orc capability. Both succeeded in uniting vast numbers of greenskins under their command. Both represented existential threats that required the full mobilization of Imperial resources to contain. The suggestion that Ghazghkull might be a reincarnation or spiritual successor to the beast, implies that this is not just another orc invasion, but potentially the beginning of a second war of the beast, an apocalyptic conflict that could reshape the entire galaxy. If Ghazghkull succeeds in his mission, if he truly manages to unite every orc in the galaxy under his banner, the implications are almost beyond comprehension. The orc species is one of the most numerous in the galaxy, potentially outnumbering humanity itself when you count all the feral tribes and isolated populations scattered across uncounted worlds. A unified orc race, all fighting with coordinated purpose under inspired leadership. Orc would be a force capable of overwhelming any defense the Imperium could mount, and they would never stop. Unlike other threats that the Imperium faces, orcs don't have strategic objectives beyond warfare itself. The Tyranids consume worlds to feed their hive fleets, but they eventually move on to new hunting grounds. Chaos seeks to corrupt and enslave, but even Chaos forces can be driven back into the warp. The Necrons pursue specific goals related to their ancient agendas. But orcs fight because fighting is what they do, and under Ghazghkull's leadership, they would fight forever, constantly adapting and evolving, never giving up, never retreating, never accepting defeat. The current state of the Warhammer 40,000 timeline leaves Ghazghkull's story unfinished and his ultimate fate unknown. He continues to travel the galaxy, uniting orc forces wherever he goes, building toward the great crusade that Gork and Mork have commanded him to lead. The Imperium continues to hunt him, with Yarrick leading the pursuit alongside entire crusades of space marines. But so far, he has evaded every trap and survived every assassination attempt. Some prophecies suggest that Ghazghkull will eventually succeed in his mission, that he will unite the orc race and launch a war so vast that Gork and Mork themselves will tear their way out of the warp to join the fighting. Other predictions hint at his eventual defeat, perhaps at Yarrick's hands, perhaps through internal orc politics, perhaps through divine intervention from the Emperor himself. But these are just speculation, stories told about a legend that is still being written. What we know for certain is that Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka has already earned his place in the annals of galactic history. He has proven himself to be more than just another orc warlord, more than just another green-skinned threat to be contained and destroyed. He is a prophet, a visionary, a military genius, and quite possibly the single most dangerous individual in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting when you consider the forces he could potentially unleash. The Imperium of Man has survived 10,000 years of constant warfare, facing down threats that would have destroyed any lesser civilization. It has weathered Chaos incursions, Tyranid invasions, Necron awakenings, and countless other existential crises. But it has never faced anything quite like Ghazghkull, because Ghazghkull represents something new. An enemy who learns from defeat, who thinks in centuries rather than moments, who can unite billions of warriors through sheer force of personality and divine mandate. The green shadow over the galaxy continues to grow. With each passing year, more orcs join Ghazghkull's crusade. With each battle, his legend becomes more powerful. With each apparent miracle, his claim of divine favor becomes harder to dispute. Slowly, inexorably, the great work continues, and the day approaches when the prophet of Gork and Mork will finally complete his mission. What happens then? What happens when every orc in the galaxy stands united under a single banner, ready to drown the stars in green fire? What happens when the eternal war that Ghazghkull has envisioned finally begins in earnest? The galaxy waits to find out, and somewhere in the darkness between the stars, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka prepares for the greatest battle of his legendary career, the culmination of everything he has worked towards since that fateful day when a bolt around to the head unlocked his destiny. The prophet of Gork and Mork, the beast of Armageddon, the greatest orc warlord who has ever lived, marches toward his appointed destiny. And the green tide rises with him, unstoppable, inevitable, eternal. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, from the tragic tales of fallen heroes to the cosmic horror of ancient evils awakening after millions of years in slumber. Each story adds another layer to this rich, dark tapestry of the far future, where there is only war. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and legend of the Prophet of Gork and Mork. Until next time, stay vigilant. The green tide is coming, and when it arrives, the galaxy will never be the same. For the Emperor, for humanity, and for all those who stand against the darkness. End of script.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.